Welcome back to Cyberology, Dakota State's podcast for all things cyber and technology. I'm your host, Jen Burris, and we have a very special episode in store for you for a few reasons. So this will be our first ever video recording, as you can see. And more importantly, I have two really amazing DSU faculty members as our co-hosts today and a very distinguished guest. So I'm happy to welcome Kanti Narukanda as a co-host today. Kanti is an assistant professor in the Beacom College and director of the Cyber Institute, where she manages undergraduate students who serve as cyber leaders. So with a passion for cybersecurity, she's earned degrees in cyber defense and embedded systems engineering and is currently pursuing her PhD in cyber defense. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm very, very excited to be here.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about CyberHer and yourself?
Yes. So CyberHer was founded in 2013. So we're celebrating 10 years of being able to do a lot of outreach with young women and young girls as well to bring awareness about cybersecurity, because we want them to understand cybersecurity is more than the dark basement and the hoodie and the clacking away at the keyboard. And to this effect, we do a lot of outreach with K through 12 students so they understand what cybersecurity is, and when they're adults, they can pursue the field. So to date, we've impacted about 45,000 students.
Very impressive. Okay, and our other co-host for today is Jason Jenkins, who is also a faculty member in the Beacom College. Jason has over 20 years of IT-related experience. Amazing. And some of that includes network administration, hardware and software support, software and web development, and more. Jack of all trades.
Yeah, pretty much.
So he's earned bachelor's degree in computer science and math and a master's in information assurance, and is currently completing his PhD in cyber defense as well. Excellent. So thank you for joining us, Jason. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I think most students are listening. A lot of folks on campus know me for teaching like software engineering, object-oriented design, sometimes web development or software security, but, just kind of looking forward to, I guess, kind of my research agenda, where I'm trying to kind of tackle some of our cybersecurity problems from the software developer standpoint and how I can, solve that, if it's tools, education, process. Not entirely sure yet, but that's kind of where I'm at in my academic journey. So.
Sure. We'll have to have you come in and talk about your research sometime then, too.
Sounds good.
Okay. I'm thrilled to introduce our distinguished guest today, Major General David Gatica, who, and so he has an extensive and illustrious career in cybersecurity. So you recently retired from the U.S. Air Force, correct?
Correct.
And you served as Vice Commander of the 16th Air Force Cybers at the Joint Base in San Antonio, Lackland in Texas, where it looks like you were preparing a lot of employees for all sorts of cyber concerns. So we're really impressed with that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you've been doing for all these years?
Sure, absolutely. So yes, I did, as you mentioned, I just retired officially on the 1st of September. So just, so now I'm a Mr. and enjoying life 2.0. And so after 18 assignments and 30 years of service, really excited to be here talking to the Dakota State University audience, an opportunity to talk to them about what we're doing here. I think, as you alluded to, for the most of your students looking at different opportunities within the IT space or within cyberspace, lots of opportunity in my last organization as a 16th Air Force and Air Force's cyber. At the same time, we also had a direct relationship with the National Security Agency and roles there, and I know that that's something else that's important to many of your students in the roles that they'll do or potential employers in the future. So look forward to the opportunity to talk about any of that as well.
Excellent. So I am going to hand it over to Kanti and Jason for questions. So take it away.
So we have this lovely list of questions
All right.
for you. As Jen mentioned, and as you mentioned, you have a you've had a distinguished career in the Air Force with a strong emphasis on cyber and information warfare. Can you share your perspective on how the role of cybersecurity has evolved within the military over the years and how it has become increasingly critical to national security?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been a tremendous evolution as we look at technology and how it's evolved as well. And if I look back to the beginning of when I started my service in the initial 90s to where we've come today, just so many of the concepts have changed. Even you think about things as simple as air gap. It was closed networks. The only way into a network was if you were physically plugged into it because it was this system, and you could have multiple enclaves all over the place and relatively safe just by the physical barriers that did or didn't exist. Today, that's changed considerably. When you think about everybody is on Wi-Fi, I would suspect there's 4 phones in the room, and we're all connected through potentially different services as well. And so those creates the vulnerable space that's out there. And so we have to be, able to defend all of that. I think one of the other things philosophically that we're looking at is the difference between the old castle moat kind of a design, right? You build a castle, you put a moat around it, and then you try to defend it. That's a significant challenge in this day and age, and that's where ideas like zero trust principles have come forward. How do you protect your data versus how do you protect your network? And I think people are responding, and there's opportunity there. And with the rise of data and data science, lots of opportunity. And I know from your students as well that are probably studying many of those different things.
All right. So getting into the student side of things a little more, how do you think our students can have an impact on protecting the critical infrastructure of our country?
That's a great question. And I think one of the things that's really important to acknowledge in that question is that critical infrastructure across our nation, because it is more than, the Department of Defense that I grew up in. And there's a lot more to it that's really important to us. And it's important to everybody, not just people that live in the state of, South Dakota, but across our nation. That critical infrastructure also is vulnerable, and we wouldn't want to have an adversary that tries to disrupt those services for our public, or in my case, when I was in uniform with our military or defense as well. But when you look at the students, how can they do this? We need those innovative thinkers. We need people to think about it differently, the ones that are studying new ideas, that have those opportunities to do it, and understanding the creative minds that you see. I've heard of recent wins with members of DSU, students of DSU that have been on teams that have winning national awards. Those are the type of people we need. And it doesn't matter if it's in industry, it doesn't matter if it's studying in a research institution, or whether it's serving in the government, whether in the military or as a civil service. We need those people, we need those sharp folks, and we need them to help us to advance, to stay ahead of both, adversaries at the national level, but also that we've seen a rise in cyber criminals and the things that they're doing and holding people, I'll say hostage with air quotes, but we need to be able to do that with the ransomware. We need people out there to do that, and the relevant studies that are being done here is exactly what we need.
Thank you.
Some of the students that you mentioned on the teams, I've had the privilege of working with them with SIPOR, and I taught them, and I can say they're super, super smart.
I bet.
They're so smart. Sometimes it scares me.
That's a good problem to have, though.
It really is.
It's a very good problem to have. I have a question that's more related to your work experience with the Air Force. So in your role as the Vice Commander of the 16th Air Force, you were responsible for cybersecurity and the defense of the Air Force's portion of the DoD Global Network. Can you discuss your role at the 16th Air Force in ensuring the readiness of Air Force personnel and its responsibility for cybersecurity? And can you also talk a little bit about what the key priorities and initiatives are within this command?
Yeah, so I left. So when I left working at 16th Air Force, the commander of the organization at the time had very distinct priorities that he published. A tentative leadership is so everybody understands what the commander's priorities are in support of all of those different missions that you talked about. So as a vice, executing his intent and meeting his vision. Interestingly, to kind of back to your question, is he had 5 priorities, and the number one priority for him was to grow readiness. And so he talked about growing readiness, strengthening resilience, personal resilience, and professional resilience, maturing information warfare. We had mentioned that, driving modernization, and then last but not least, increasing our combat effectiveness because we are a military organization. But what you talk about readiness, that's incredibly important. And it's so that when called upon to do so, whatever the nation asks of us, that those members are ready to perform their duties and responsibilities. And under his command, there was more than just cyber. He had many other responsibilities. He had the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance enterprise was under him as well as some of our electromagnetic warfare capabilities too. But when you think about that readiness, it's absolutely critical so that they're doing that. And when we talk about it in relation to cybersecurity, it's the personal readiness of the airmen and the guardians and anyone in our command to accomplish the mission. But the other part is that infrastructure that we already alluded to, the critical infrastructure. Is it ready for what it might have to encounter, endure? And so that's a continual relationship. And as we know in tech, that cycle of advancements is rapid. We talk about Moore's Law, but I think Moore's Law, sometimes I wonder, okay, that was good at a time, and the principles are sound, but things are happening awful quick when we come to the cyberspace and the innovations that's out there, both good and bad.
So, again, more about your work experience.
Sure.
So, the Pentagon is at the heart of the U.S. defense operations. And how did your previous role as the Director of Cyberspace Operations and Warfighter Integration at the Pentagon contribute to ensuring, again, the resilience and security of critical defense networks and systems? And as a follow-up, what were some of the key objectives there and some key responsibilities there that you undertook to enhance the DoD's cyberspace capabilities?
Absolutely. So when you think about the Pentagon, it's the highest levels of our military in the Department of Defense. All the service chiefs are located there, as well as the Secretary of Defense. When you have this huge enterprise, it's a corporate level. So my roles and responsibilities in there were largely for those, policy guidance and the kind of the governance and advocating for funding for different things that were important to do, is trying to, focus on different resources we needed for different efforts. Some of the things that I was really proud of that we accomplished back in my time during that is still holding true today, and that was our drive to complete the creation of the Cyber Mission Force, the CMF. And so the way that U.S. Cyber Command had done it at that time is they said, okay, we're going to have each of the services are going to be responsible for producing a certain amount of teams, and that will make up the Cyber Mission Force that then U.S. Cyber Command can use. And some of those were those teams that the Cyber Command would say, okay, we're going to put them out on this mission. And then as well as some of those teams would still focus on the Air Force and Air Force capabilities. But the creation of that to become fully operational capable at that time was a big drive and something that I was pretty proud of. And then the other one is the continued advocacy for funding and to explain to people the importance of the foundation of our IT networks, and that it is actually it's a command and control imperative. If you want to be able to talk to your forces anywhere in the field, whether it be with data and email or voice, you have to connect in this world. And that is all completely based on a strong and resilient and secure network. And so to be able to fight for the funding and explain why is this important and why is this more important than that was a exciting and interesting 3 years to operate at that kind of corporate level. And it wasn't just with the service. Oftentimes it was also with the joint community, the other services, as well as the Department of Defense. And so for students leaving here, that if they find themselves, whether in civil service or whether in a military organization, tremendous opportunity to make a difference, to be able to help, to be able to shape that. Really lots of different ways to do that with some of the big programs that they were doing.
I have a bit of a more broad question for you, but I think you'll have a great answer to it. What lessons from military tactics can cyber defense professionals apply to their work?
There's so many, and when you think about some of the, principles of warfare or things that we've studied, but it's terrain. The cyber, it is terrain, and whether that is through the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum. Again, we talked about Wi-Fi devices or satellite communications and all of that technology. It's all terrain, and if you're in the cybersecurity business, you have to make sure that the things that are passing through it are what you want it to be, whether that's through conventional cable, whether that's through fiber, or whether it's through the air. But some of those things that you find are some of those basic principles, such as surprise or defense in depth, or even defending forward. And the partnerships, the international relationships that you create are critical to be able to say, because if you're one of my closest allies and I'm going to be networked with you, then we want to make sure if you're able to pass me information that's secure and safe. Or in times of crisis, if I just want to communicate with you, how am I going to be able to commute sensitive information on a bilateral level where I can communicate with you to say, hey, what's going on, or this is happening, and how do we establish that communication network and that architecture so that we know at the national level, these are leaders of countries, leaders of institutions, that they're able to have those communication capability. And there's a role for the things that all the types of studies and the programs that are in here that are directly related to that.
Thank you very much.
So this is, I want to say, somewhat of a broader kind of question. So like you'd mentioned, the cyber threat landscape is ever evolving, ever changing. Can you share an example of a significant cyber incident or a threat that you encountered during your career, and how your team, or what steps your team took to mitigate that threat or that event?
Sure, and a little difficult to go into some of the specifics just for different reasons, but I think that some that your audience would understand, and they're really good case studies to look at what's happening right now, are some of the significant things we found. So I'll give you, I'll say 2.5. One would be the SolarWinds. So we saw the crisis with SolarWinds when it happened, and we realized that vulnerability. And it's also to see how that is communicated, right? So which version is vulnerable versus it isn't just any SolarWinds, but some of the different things, and to make sure you understood that. Then the other one, I think, which was a significant event, but seemed it happened and then it went away, was the Colonial Pipeline attack that we saw as well, and what that did with our economy, what that did to but we went right past it really quick. But significant events. And then the other one that we often encounter, often is probably not appropriate, but that we have encountered in recent times, is intellectual property theft, and how adversaries or criminals are trying to gain and take that information. And so when you look at those and say, so how would we respond? The Department of Defense, it is not a law enforcement agency. By law, it's not allowed to be a law enforcement agency. And at the same time, the Department of Defense isn't able to come to the defense of private industry. And so that's an interesting dynamic, but our civilian leadership in our country will ask the military experts. They might ask Cyber Command, hey, we had an incident in cyber, what are we going to do about it? And some of those are those special relationships that we have with other agencies, whether it be law enforcement agencies like the FBI, or whether it be on an international level with partners to say, hey, are you seeing this? But all of those things, the first thing you're going to do, it's almost, sometimes I use the analogy of the house, that whether it's your house that got broken into or it's your neighbor's house that got broken into, but you get on the phone and say, how did they get into your house? And they said, hey, they figured out how to open the screen door in the back. Like, oh my gosh, I have 2 screen doors in the back. And so you go, okay, are they secure? We would recommend you do the following. And it's being able to take the team that you're leading to look at what are those vulnerabilities that exist. And then once you've identified, oh my gosh, we have the vulnerability, or thank goodness we don't have the vulnerability, then you go about solving that problem as rapidly as you can. And that's sometimes tough, because then it turns around and it's the same thing. Hey, and now I need more resources, or I need more funding, because what I need is that hardware, is that software, what's the fix, and how long does it take to implement? We have lots of priorities on that list and lots of CVEs, lots of cyber vulnerabilities that are out there. And it's a bit of triaging of, what am I going to fix first? Is there just a cut in my screen and I'm okay because I got a camera on it to make sure no one comes in? Or is it a leaky roof that the whole house is about to come down? And every one of those has a different response. And then you have that tiered level, right? As you go, okay, how bad of a threat is it? But we've seen it. We've seen it in the commercial sector. There's too many cases to look at with ransomware, criminal activity. And then as I alluded to, the intellectual property theft, because sometimes you would think, and this is important too for small businesses that you partner with here for the institution, or as your students go out and work, is clear defense contractors, right? Small companies that are out there working with the government, and are they vulnerable? How secure is their network? Maybe an adversary doesn't look at the big Department of Defense, but instead says, hey, we'll just go after one of the contractors that's building something for us. So we've got to help everybody in part of that network to be secure.
So the house analogy, great example, because that helps people understand how you approach a house. Exactly. And that weighted scale of assessing your priorities or even rating your threats. Oh, this is the most likely to occur, or this has the most potential to have the most impact on our company. That's a great example.
Excellent.
And what you'd mentioned with the preparing and communicating, I think one of the problems that we normally see is that organizations, or any type of organizations, they're kind of reluctant to share that they have been under attack. That brings down their market value, that brings down the confidence in the public, in their company. And I wish there were an easier way, or I wish people would move past that mentality to say,
Feel more comfortable in helping other people out to
Exactly.
avoid the same scenarios.
Exactly. Because this is how it is going to be going forward, is everything is going to be, online. And we need to be able to be in
Share.
a state where we're able to protect ourselves and lend resources so others can protect themselves.
I think so. And I think that even on that note, that we're only limited by our creativity.
Exactly.
And which is why I know the next generation of students coming out can help us with that. And I think you touched on many reasons why you'll find, corporations are hesitant to share that. But there's also ways that they can do that safely through building a team and sharing. And I think some of those venues exist. It's just not necessarily in the public space for the reasons, just because of the reasons of they don't want to lose confidence and credibility in their business model. It's understandable.
Yeah.
And I think that topic, one of the things you mentioned is why we talk so much about things like vendor management and cyber defense.
Exactly.
It's so important. And if you look at a lot of the big data breaches, that's where really the root problem of where some of them came from. And kind of gets into, one of your teaching interests, Kanti, cyber law, maybe data breach laws need to be tightened up a little bit so there isn't so much of that. Companies are kind of being allowed to be hesitant, in some ways. So anyway, not to full on go into that.
Of course not, but it brings forward a good point too. Third-party management is as important as securing your own network. You need to have good relations with third parties or those vendors who have good security posture themselves. And then to bring in the law portion of it, I think cyber law is still evolving. There still needs to be more done in the field. And I think we will see a lot more adjustments or advancements in that field soon.
Agreed.
You've held positions in various locations around the world, including South Korea, Germany, and Qatar. How did these international assignments shape your perspective on global military operations and collaboration with these international partners?
Absolutely. In a number of different ways, it shaped my views early in my career. As an example, you mentioned living in Germany, and I was part of a NATO organization, a flying organization. And we had, at that time, 13 NATO nations working together to accomplish a similar mission. Those partnerships are amazing. To be able to do that and people work together and at that human level to realize, hey, we do have a shared set of values, a shared set of what we think. How do we do this together? and it is really important. And in the context of cybersecurity and the IT business, it's equally important for us to be able to have the ability to share, just like we talked about with industry and even somewhat proprietary information or networks and how companies would share that with one another. It's the same thing with other governments, that we need to be able to share technology or to advise one another on adversary tactics, and so that you can say, what have you seen and what have I seen? I think a great example of that's very successful that your audience could read about is the initiative that U.S. Cyber Command has with Hunt Forward Operations. And this is where those partnership with other nations that have said, hey, America, hey, U.S. Cyber Command, we would welcome you coming to our nation and getting on some of our networks and helping to see if there's any malicious actors that are on here. And you can read about those instances and those things that have done. And then for them to be able to take things that maybe we find and be able to update that with the larger community about techniques or different viruses or malware that we find out there. Lots of opportunity to build confidence with one another, and then also to get the bad guy out. And some of it's on network, which is one thing, and then some of it's basic education, depending on the nature of this. But the United States has so many friends and allies that are out there, and to build that relationship and in that domain of cyberspace is really, really important. And something I was proud of to see that we were able to. And some of those relationships are sensitive with different countries, of course, but you can see the tangible examples are available out there in the open press.
That's very cool. Yeah. That you can just go out there and find all this information.
Yeah, and the other part of that, when we talk about, and we've talked about cybersecurity, but then the other part of this, when you think about the mission set and the different things that you do in cyberspace, there is, as we know, there's offensive cyber operations, and then there's the defensive cyber operations. So that difference in defensive cyber operations from the traditional cybersecurity of a network or a device, but the defensive operations to go out there that I would consider the Hunt Forward operations to be, where you're out there, and it goes back to the military principle of defending forward. You go forward into that space that's outside and say, hey, we're going to defend here, because it just increases kind of our defense and, oh, by the way, helps them at the same time. It's a really good mutually beneficial relationship between the partners that invite us in to help them.
Well, I'll admit I was kind of inspired to include this question because of some of the research some of our cyber defense PhDs are working on. But one of the significant issues facing cyber defense is staffing of cybersecurity positions. And, just in your opinion, what do you think can or should be done to help with this? And, what did you kind of do to help out in this area when you were still working in the military?
Well, I think at the national level, I'm impressed that it's recognized the criticality of these skill sets, of these graduates, of these experts that are out there. And so we as a nation need them to work both whether it be in government service or even industry partners that are working within the department or across any of our federal agencies. But interestingly, if some of the research that's out there, Congress has given, in the case of the DoD, they've given services authority to do many things to aid in both recruitment and retention. And it's really, really hard. So we talked about priorities in the beginning of my boss, and he talked about growing readiness. Part of that readiness was keeping the skilled workforce that you have. If you train a bunch of people and they leave to go work for a high-paying institution that the federal government cannot compete with, or a public university has a challenge competing with, it's how do you retain those people? But Congress has given us ideas, everything from direct commissioning programs to rapidly commission people, to bring someone from the outside in as an officer in the military that's more commensurate with this. We do this in the medical community, we'll go out and get specialists like an endodontist or an oral surgeon, and we'll bring them in and give them higher rank, not supervisory responsibilities necessarily, but the higher rank for pay. There's different means to give bonuses, selective bonuses that can go into that. There's even promotions. It's written in there because the military officer promotions are confirmed by the Senate, but they still gave special provisions in there to say, hey, you could promote people based on their position. Now, there's a process that the services have to go through to do that, but it's there. And then the other one is the rapid hiring. So they've given a lot of authorities for hiring government civilians directly into positions that don't have to go through all the competitive stages that you would with the normal government civilian position. And so we dabbled in all of these things. But the United States Air Force, not counting the broader Department of the Air Force with the Space Force, but you talk about the United States Air Force, roughly 330,000 people. It's a big institution. It's a big corporation. And to make some of these moves, you have the second and third order impacts that they have to think through. That's some of the challenges. So my frustration would be do it faster. Having been in the Pentagon, I understand why sometimes that's hard, but and we'll talk about that. We can talk about in my discussion this afternoon of go fast. It's what we've got to do, but it's out there, and there's internships and abilities for people if this is what you want to do. And you don't have to do it in uniform, which is really important for people. But if you want to come in as a civil servant, there's those programs where you could rapidly move up. And then if you want to do that for a career, great. And if not, then if you want to go out into industry with that knowledge, there's lots of opportunity. Great, relevant question.
Thank you, and thanks for the answer. So I'm going to kind of combine these next two bits. But what I want to ask you about, so you originally had a degree in English, but obviously went into the Air Force for a number of years. How has that English background impacted your strategy for effectively communicating complex cybersecurity issues to senior military and civilian leaders? Any methods or approaches that you've noticed that are particularly effective?
Well, thanks for that question as well. Thanks for looking at my bio and understanding where I grew up and what I did. And I was just talking to your provost about that today, about kind of that evolution of education and higher education and some of the different focuses. Because clearly, Dakota State University is very much focused on many of the technological fields of study that are out there. But to more specifically answer your question, so there's a trick in there somewhere for you that I guess I'll reveal here. So I actually started with a math focus. And so this is what happens when you're a 19 or 20-year-old and you're allowed to make your own decisions because your parents trust you with your own education. And so I won't mention the class. I'll think about mentioning the class. But anyway, so I had a particular math class that frustrated me to no end at one day. And so I switched to English. So I have a math minor. Okay. So I have that background. But I really enjoyed English. And I was never the talented writer. But what studying literature did for me was I realized the critical thinking and the analytical thinking that goes into what someone is trying to impart through you in communication in the written word. And to do some of those things is to be critical of what you're reading or watching. And one of my favorite classes with film is narrative. To look at movies and go, okay, that's not a movie, that's a story. Who wrote the story? What's it about? And what are they telling you? And then to have to write about that and defend a position, those skill sets are really good. But then the other part of how have I leveraged that in my career in the military, one of the things that is I have found myself becoming is a translator. So I grew up in aviation, flying in the back of large frame aircraft like the E-3 AWACS or the E-8 JSTARS, different aircraft that our U.S. Air Force operates. And so I grew up in that aviation community. When you look at the senior leadership of our United States Air Force, many of them are aviators for good reason. And so I found myself in that role as the translator. So as someone who grew up in that community, that as I became a general officer and I moved into cyberspace and IT and ISR and EW and all those acronym soup, I apologize to your audience for. But when you think about cyber, information technology, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and electromagnetic spectrum operations, when you think of all that, what I've found myself doing is I am now the advocate to saying, let me explain to you why this is important. And I do an analogy like the house, or I do a football analogy, or whatever I think speaks to that person, or I'll do a warfighting analogy. As simple as, hey, you have the greatest aircraft in the world and you wanted to bring it to bear against your adversaries. Well, what if someone could do something that would deny that aircraft the ability to take off? And you know what? They don't even have to touch the aircraft. After all, air gap doesn't matter anymore, so there's that. So let's think about that. And then let's even think about the petroleum or the electricity it takes. Lots of different vulnerabilities. What do you care about there, boss? So I think that's what it did. It made me a good translator. Even though I don't have a aptitude for foreign languages.
Thanks.
Okay, so in the interest of keeping track of your time and your schedule for the day, we'll wrap it up with one more question.
Okay. Over to both of you.
Sure. This is more of a looking into the future kind of question. How, over your career, you've seen the landscape of cybersecurity change a little bit and warfare evolve as well. What do you see in the future as challenges? What challenge?
So the one thing that I think that is unique about the environment, and probably something I'll talk about this afternoon as well with some of the students and faculty, is the change in the information environment. And it has changed dramatically when you look at this. And I don't just mean the news media, although there's a part of that. But what we found with our networks, with the internet, and with cyber in general, is the ability to connect people across the globe. We're all connected. But with that comes great responsibility, because what I find most uniquely different is the ability for any one of us in the room can actually reach out and touch another nation's population. You could post something and reach a huge audience that you could never reach before. And so that is powerful for good, and that can be unfortunately powerful for bad. And then when you also combine that with the ideas of both misinformation and disinformation, it's a complex landscape. And so that landscape has clearly evolved in my time, and there's goodness in to be able to help people understand and to help those that require help. But there is great risk when you have people that are putting things out into the environment that just aren't true. And we could all probably come up with a good example of seeing something that goes, wow, that's not real. I know it's not real. Does everybody else know that that's not real? That's fake, not fact. Even the use of words, a bomb versus an explosion, which is fact.
Yeah.
If you make a headline that says a bomb went off, and go, okay, or did an explosion go off? Those
Goes
words.
back to the critical thinking and analytical skills.
Absolutely. Yep. So it is. It's different, but those are the challenges, right? We're gonna figure out how to navigate that. Quite frankly, I think my generation is better than my parents' generation to think through that, and I think that the younger generation and the students that you have here at Dakota State University are more equipped to do that than I am. And so I look forward to the innovation and the ideas that our discerning, intelligent next generation will bring for all of us.
Thank you for answering all of our questions.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, this was excellent, very informative and interesting, and I think a lot to digest for everyone.
You're
and thank you
welcome.
to Major General Gatica.
Thanks. It's great. I'm excited to have had the opportunity to talk to both faculty members, clearly are experts in this domain as well. Proud of what you're doing to educate them, because you two are making a difference, both for their lives, but then when you look at do something bigger, be a part of something that's bigger than yourself. I think both of you are doing that when you look at what you're doing for the institution and for quite frankly for our way of life and our ideals and beliefs and what we think. So you guys are doing great. I was proud to be on this with you, and thanks so much.
And thank you, Jason Jenkins.
Yes.
Thank you for watching our very first video episode. And if you enjoyed it, please subscribe.